Dear Asian Americans, let's celebrate, support, and inspire. Welcome to episode 3 of Dear Asian Americans. I am your host, Jerry Wan, and today I am so excited to share with you my conversation with Rajiv Satyal, aka the Funny Indian. There's a good chance that you've seen Rajiv perform his jokes all across the world and on the internet, where he's now racked up more than 50 million views across all the platforms. Rajiv shares with us his story as an Indian American child growing up in Ohio, his academic and early professional career, where he worked at one of the world's largest companies, and on to marketing bottled water of all things, and eventually what he does now, which is to bring smiles to all of our faces. And we'll also hear how he was the first comic ever to perform on all 7 continents. I am glad that I can call Rajiv a friend, and I am so happy to be able to share my conversation with you today. So without further ado, I present to you Rajiv Satyal.
Hey, Rajiv, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
This is the launch week of Dear Asian Americans, so I've collected a gathering of my favorite Asian Americans who are, one, doing a lot of great work in the community, but I wanted to focus this week on Asian Americans in the community who are bringing positive reinforcement and good, attention to us. So I thought of you. We've known each other for some time, and you're funny as hell, number one. And I know that you make a lot of people proud to be Indian American and Asian American. So introduce yourself to the audience.
Wow, thank you very much for the kind words. Appreciate that. It's been a pleasure to know you as well online. What are the kids saying? IRL in real life, offline, but mostly our interactions I know are on the good book on Facebook, as it were. So I'm a stand-up comic originally from Cincinnati, Ohio. Been living in Los Angeles, California for 14 years. Been doing stand-up for 14 years. I don't know. I have 12 videos with 100,000 or more views. The I Am Indian video went super viral. It has maybe almost 1 million on YouTube, but it mostly went viral on Facebook. There's one share that has about 20 million views, and then it really went viral on WhatsApp. And that's my luck. Asians, Indians included, love numbers, but there are no metrics on WhatsApp. So our best guess is it's 50 million views. Who knows?
That is awesome, man. And one of the things, before we go into your story and how you ended up here, one thing that I want the audience to know and why I think you resonate so well is you are an Indian American comic or an Asian American comic who has not used accent shticks or self-deprecating as a community jokes to, make somebody laugh. I think it's very timely. Hank Azaria recently said, I'm not doing the Apu voice anymore. And so that's created a lot of conversation in our community of, was that ever funny to begin with? And while I do think it's cool that he says no now, dude, you've been doing it for 30 years. And I'm sure this wasn't the first time somebody said, maybe you should stop.
True. I wrote a piece about it. It was funny, and it's kind of, probably why I'm not more successful than I am. I call myself the man in the middle. I wrote a piece that went viral on Medium. It was made the front page, and the editors contacted me and got a lot of looks on it. And it was a pretty liberal piece about the boys who cried wolf. And it was a very pro-Michelle Wolf piece after her take at the correspondence dinner. And then I wrote a piece called The Problem with Apu. And it was more of a conservative take on, hey, look, I was in defense of Hank Azaria and some of the things that he did. In this very room, I had Utkur Shambudkar, and he was on my show to talk about The Simpsons and some of the other things he did, because he was the first Indian ever to appear and the first South Asian to appear on The Simpsons, then do a voice and all that kind of stuff. So long conversation about, was it okay, evolving standards, etc. So sometimes you just reach a fever pitch. Something was conceived of in the late 80s. It becomes a job, and who gets hurt? But then eventually you hear the stories of people who are hurt by it. And you hear the people, the Asian folks coming up, the Indian folks coming up who say, actually, that voice was pretty painful to me. It hurt me. It gave a lot of white kids ammunition to harm me and things like that. So, I applaud Hank Azaria for coming around to that. But the timing of it, I don't know him and I don't know his heart. So it's very, very difficult.
Sure. I just bring that up because I think you watch a lot of comics from our community, and this is not an attack on anybody personally, but I do think that in the spirit or in the mission to get somebody to book you or to laugh at you, making fun of yourself, which is fine. But then when myself then becomes my entire country or my entire language, particularly when it comes to negative stereotypes or accents, I do think that you're not necessarily thinking about the little kid who then has to deal with the repercussions of that many, many years later.
True.
You're from Cincinnati, Ohio.
True.
Tell us a little bit about how the Satyal family ended up there, and more so of how growing up in Ohio has impacted. How did that inform your view and your self-awareness as an Asian American?
Yeah, so at the time it was interesting. We only probably had I guess about 5 or 6 Asian kids. So when I think of Asian, be interesting to get your take on this. I think of South Asian and East Asian, right? So East Asian being folks who look like you, South Asian
Hmm.
people who look like me, and all that sort of thing. There were two in my class of 500 of Indians. I think Sheila Mira and I think we're the only two Indians. I hope I'm not missing anyone at this point. It's been 20 plus years, guys. Sorry. And Asian wise, Jason Chang, who's Chinese, Gail Santos, who's Filipino, I believe. I hope I got that right. And there were there might have been a couple other folks, but for the most part, I think that might have been it. And Jason Chang, shout out to him. We were friends. He's still in DC. We saw each other last year. He was an Asian hood. He listened to metal and he had long hair and he had leather pants and ripped jeans and all that kind of stuff. And to me, I wasn't like, oh, he's an Asian guy who's into that. Oh, that was just Jason Chang. And he was just, he was just a
Right.
metalhead. That's what he was. And, the things that I was into, I was just into. But later I found out, oh, wow, all Indians are into tennis and all Asians play ping pong and all of us are good at spelling and all the things that I was good at. I found out later that those were stereotypes, but I'm like, wow, I guess I am the stereotypical Indian Asian guy in America.
Oh, that's fascinating. Because I think we think of, and I don't want to say most, but the more vocalized or more shared Asian experiences come from, the major cities that obviously there's reasons why, groups have immigrated there en masse. But you even went to, college in Ohio. The demographics then, it's currently about 5% Asian. I'm sure it wasn't any higher, when you were in
Definitely
school.
lower, yes.
At what point did you realize some of the people see me differently, or that I need to celebrate my Indian American culture? Or when did you have that realization?
I think that realization didn't happen until much later. It was when I went to college. I went to Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, and was talking to two Asian guys this morning and last night from Case Western, actually, and just trying to figure out some stuff with them plan wise. But we all kind of gravitated towards each other. And it was the first time on our floor that we had Asian, Black, white, Latino, Native American, everybody. It was all boys. I guess I got to say men now, 18 plus on this floor. It's funny thinking of us as men when you're 18 years old and doing what we were doing. But we were overtly racist in an inclusive way because we had Jewish, we had Christian, we had Hindu, we had
Mhm.
Muslim, and the stereotypical jokes came out as a way to bond with each other. And you would always check in. I don't know if you watch Succession on HBO, but they're really mean to each other on this show. But there are points where somebody is genuinely hurt and genuinely in a position of weakness, and you get that sibling camaraderie of one of them looking at each other like, "You okay, bro? Are you all right?" And so they love each other. Like deep
Right.
down, it's like I want to rib you, I want to rib you, and I want to rip on you and all that. But if you're really hurt, I want to make sure you're not actually hurt. This is a joke, right? Or this is cool. So I think that's kind of how we grew up.
What were sort of your parents' expectations in terms of what you should study, right? So you don't major in stand-up comedy.
Very true.
And you don't go to that if obviously you knew or you wanted to come back to LA to do stand-up comedy. So take me through your process of what you thought were expectations of you. When did you know you wanted to do comedy? And what was that struggle like between what you thought you should be doing based on parent and community expectations and Rajiv being the funny guy that you are today?
Sure. No, that's funny. I just got back from Antarctica, as one does, and I went with Joe Cucci. He was my roommate in college, and of Italian descent, but white guy basically in America. And we were talking about this, the idea of how we were raised. And his father became very, very successful at Procter and Gamble. I worked there as well, and I said, to this day, I was raised believing that, and even now when I see people, I'm like, okay, there are doctors and there are failures. Like, that's it. Like, everyone else is like Michael Jordan, Barack Obama, us, whatever we're doing, no matter how successful you get, it's like, that's cool, but you're not a doctor, right? It's that.
Even
it's almost like
lawyers don't make that list either.
in the Indian community at the time in the 80s, it was only doctors. And then it opened
And even
up.
just doctors, MDs, right? Like they
MDs.
discriminated.
Only MDs, even PhDs didn't get that kind of respect. It was, you have to be a medical doctor. That was it. Not a podiatrist, not a chiropractor, not a dentist. No, a medical doctor, not even a DO. Just, I know all of this. 'cause
Sure,
obviously it was
right.
then.
Me too, yeah.
Well, you know all the lingo, right? So all of that being the case, it was just like, that's all you could be. And then it became, yeah, maybe you could be a dentist or an engineer. And then later it was like, okay, maybe a lawyer. And then there was this hierarchy, right? And, we before we hit record, we were talking about race. There is a lot of racism in all communities, but it's like, okay, if you don't marry an Indian person, okay, then Asian. That's the next
Sure,
thing.
right.
Like, East Asian, okay, if you break up like a Korean woman, that's like the next thing, right?
Right.
And then actually above that, if you're North Indian, then it's like, okay, South Indian will do. Then it's like, okay, then maybe Asian. Okay, then maybe white, right? So there's this whole like hierarchy to it, which is horribly racist. It's a horrible thing to say. But similarly, the attitude started to widen. And now you have people coming up to you saying, oh, it's great that you're representing the community. You're on stage. You're giving us a voice, which is great to hear. But Joe's family, his parents raised him to say, I was raised, when you're smart, you become a doctor. He was raised, when you're smart, you can do anything you want. And he goes, I'm not saying that's better. And I interrupted him. I said, no, that's better. Trust me, that's a better outlook on the world. It is better to grow up with parents who tell you that, and a community who tells you that says you can do anything you want when you're smart, because that empowers and enables us to do something instead of saying, nope, it's numbers, it's science, it's math. And otherwise I probably would have done theater and politics and a bunch of the other soft stuff that I do, but that wasn't real. That doesn't count in our community.
Correct.
Like if you got a degree other than engineering or pre-med by that point, the 90s, you failed. You didn't do it.
I think there's so many people listening to this. I'm in my mid-30s. Like, you're in your mid-30s doing something that you were told to do or you thought was the right thing. Or, heck, maybe you're a high school or a college student. And you're like, wait a minute, I want to do comedy. I want to tell stories for a living. I think the idea and the dream, and part of the reason I am doing this, is to let all those people know, I don't care if you're 36 or 16. You should be able to pursue what you want. And I think part of the thing that came to me very later in life, and I'm still, relatively young and have so much to learn, but is that I think our parents are extremely well-intentioned, but what they didn't necessarily do was to separate their sacrifice with the result of sacrifice. It was a lot of, I moved here, I worked my ass off, therefore the only way you can make good on that sacrifice is if you fill in the blank. And that fill in the blank, it sounds like for you, was MD only. For different communities, it's
lawyer, doctor.
Sure. And, or, in the community I grew up, it's like, if you became a pastor, then that was sort of cool, right? Because then it's, but only if you get a master's or whatever, right? So I think it's super inspiring to hear stories like yours, that you went down a certain path. You mentioned you worked at Procter & Gamble. What did you do there? Was that?
I started in purchasing, actually. It's funny because I was majoring in materials engineering at the University of Cincinnati. So I basically failed out of Case Western because I was directionless. I was pre-med, but I was, when I look back now with 20 plus years of perspective, you go, why is that? You go, because that's not what you wanted to do. And I had the brain, but not the heart for it. And it's really one of the passages or one of the lines that had a lot of effect on me early. When I was 18, I read this, but it took a long time to sink in, was The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. And there's a part where Howard Rourke, the hero, is sitting in his mentor's office, or the person who he admires, who was a failed, as a creative, you'll also appreciate this, kind of a comics comic. He was an architect's architect. He was someone who never became commercially successful, but he had a vision, a very specific, uncompromising vision of what he wanted to do. And Howard Rourke just goes, I just want to be you. I want to do what you want to do. I can do that for 30 years. And the man yells back at him, do you know how many nights there are in 30 years? And that always stuck with me, because whatever parents tell you, or uncles and aunties and all these people, you're the one who has to live the life.
Right.
You're the one who has to get up every morning and go do it. You have to go to bed at night staring at the ceiling thinking, what am I doing with my life? That's your life. You're in your own soul, in your own brain, your own atma, whatever you want to call it. That's all within us. So if you hate it, dude, that's going to be really, really tough to just slog through 30 years. I mean, it's hard enough getting through 1 year of something you really don't want to do, let alone 30. Jeez.
Yeah, I think the other side of separating the sacrifice from the expectation of sacrifice is on our end, is that we can do both. And what I mean by that is, you can love your parents and be forever grateful for all the stuff that they did to you, but still say, yet I want to do something that makes me happy, right? I think people aren't necessarily too truthful, I think, when it comes to things like this, because you don't want to hurt your parents.
Of course.
But it's, I wish you'd let me do something else, right? So, it's really funny. So I had a conversation with my dad in the last couple of years, and I went to school. I went to USC. I sold real estate, and went to business school and did consulting, and took a very, very interesting path around. But just the idea of marketing and people and selling was always sort of interest to me. So many, many years later, in the last couple of years. Talking to my dad, and I vaguely remember this, but it was reinforced that back when we were growing up in Korea in the 80s, there were only a finite number of channels. My brother and I loved watching the commercials. So what my parents would do is to record just the commercials.
Wow.
And then
so reverse DVR.
Yeah. And then just the commercials, which would, if your advertisers are listening, this is like, oh my God, this is delightful, right?
I know. I'll have to tag P&G in this. They're going to be jumping up and down.
And then so, when we needed to be entertained or whatnot, they would just play a loop of the commercials because that's what got me interested, or that's what, piqued my interest. And I said, wait, you knew that when I was 5, and why the hell didn't you push me or at least encourage me to do marketing? Or, it was, but it wasn't in their world, right? My dad's a doctor. So like in his even more, not narrow view, but in his world, he became a doctor and that was a path to success. And so it was, let's make sure that you guys have that same opportunity. I think I knew in junior high school that I didn't want to become a doctor. And so my parents sort of accepted that. It took a little bit longer for my brother. Jay, if you're listening, sorry.
Our condolences.
And, and then he didn't go to med school either, but at least, I think they expected him, and then he felt the pressure to go down that medical path for some time. But I do think that we all come to a point where, we wake up one day and go, wait a minute, I have to live the next how many ever years. I have to then not only live with myself, but organize and categorize my feelings towards my parents of what I did with their sacrifice. Then looking forward, now I have 2 young children. It's like, can I look my kids in the eye when they're older and say, I made you proud, or I did this for you, or, a little bit more beyond, I hustle my ass off so we can pay rent, which is very, very important. But, what are we teaching our kids to dream big and, pursue things if all the aunts and uncles are doing one of 3 things, right? So
True.
When did you know that you wanted to leave a career at P&G and head west, as they say?
As they say, head west. Well, it's funny that you also had a Freudian slip when you said all the things our parents do to us. And I'm like, because there's some things they do to us and there's some things they do for us, right? But it's funny that came out like that. And you're right, though. There are things that we don't necessarily want to say, but it's true. So as far as answering your question in terms of coming out west, I think I knew I wanted to do it deep down, but I was getting a degree in materials engineering at University of Cincinnati. And I was number 1 in my class at this point in time. I really, really focused, failed out at Case Western, moved home, really, really hyper-focused, and worked really hard. And my classmates would tease me. They're like, well, of course you're number 1 in the class. You didn't take the weed out classes here. You got you essentially basically skipped the first couple of years. That's where we got all our C's. Now we're getting our specialty courses. I go, that's not hard. That's not fair. The higher classes are harder. Oh, come on. All these professors just give you an A or whatever. It's like, oh, come on. That's not how it works. But I do understand what they're saying is that you miss the hard part of the curve, the weed out classes. But at any rate, heading towards graduation, number 1. And then I was going to go work as in semiconductors. I was going to work as a wafer fabrication engineer in the Silicon Valley, which that is hyper Asian. That is right up the alley. And so I was going to do that, but then I got a call from Procter & Gamble. I grew up in Cincinnati, that's world headquarters, and it was on the business side. It was in purchasing, product supply, and eventually I moved into marketing. So to your point about advertising, I loved advertising too. I still do. And I did that. So, 6 years of that sort of stuff. And then I turned 30, I flipped out, and I realized I'd been in Ohio my whole life. And I got a job at Fiji Water out here. My manager, I actually worked with mostly Asians there too. I'm not playing up the Asian angle just because you're here. It's just funny that in the last 24 hours, all these memories are coming up.
It's like stumbling distance to Satyal, which is
that's
right.
Exactly
so
right.
right.
You know where it is. Yeah, it's on
it's
Olympic
very
Boulevard.
Asian, even location
wise.
It is
an extremely Asian location. We would go out to have sushi every now and then, but I didn't go out to lunch much because we were so busy. We worked 14-hour days. Who knows it would be that hard to market water, right? But it is the hardest marketing in the world because it's water. I see you've got a water bottle here. I've got a water bottle here. It's hard. It's water. How much can it be different? Well, it can be, and a lot of that is going to be branding and advertising as well. So I got out here almost by accident. I mean, I took control of myself just saying, okay, I want to go do something. I got to make a geographical change. I got to do something. I wish I would have had the balls just to be like, all right, I'm just going to leave everything and go do stand-up comedy. I've been doing it for 4 years on the side, but that's really early. To the kids out there, you might think 4 years is a long time. It's not in this game. 4 years as a comic is very, very little. So to come out here at 4 years, but older, because I started late. I started when I was 26. A lot of the kids these days are starting, my gosh, dude, like teens, they're getting up at open mics and stuff like that. And certainly 18, 19. So
When they got the cell phone. So whether it's on
Absolutely.
Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, right.
Right. That's all of that stuff. So, and I didn't say TikTok just because it's Chinese, right? But, I did make this point, though. I said this 2-3 years ago. We're talking about China versus the United States. I said, the day that China invents something that we use in America is where the game it's going to change. And that's what TikTok is. Because all of this stuff is still invented in the Silicon Valley, YouTube and Google and Instagram and even Snapchat. But TikTok came from overseas.
Correct.
And that's when you're finally seeing a tidal change of, whoa, we didn't innovate TikTok? That might take down Instagram. We don't know, but it might.
Correct. Because WeChat and other things never had traction here.
Globally, they did well. WhatsApp is still king. I think WeChat, and I think there's one. Is WeChat the one that's used in China broadly, or there's another one that's used?
And then Kakao Talk is the big Korean one.
Right.
So those things I still use it, but it's not a household name.
Absolutely. And certainly not here.
Correct.
And there's no fame like American fame. Being able to crack this market is always
and
goal.
The coveted Gen Z, Gen Alpha, the teenager forever brand loyal and right.
They're
so
all on TikTok.
It's wild.
It's crazy.
What did you want to get off your chest so much to express yourself with the microphone on a stage? What was some of that content like?
Yeah, no, and you gave me a lot of credit for not leaning into the accent, into the ethnic angle. It's funny. So I'll take some credit for that, but then also some blame for that. Because at the time, the first 2 years, I didn't do any ethnic material at all. I was in Cincinnati, Ohio, started a Go Bananas comedy club in a suburb of Cincinnati. And the majority of the audiences are white and maybe some black, but no Asian, no Indian, no Latino even, or certainly no Native American or anything like that. So it was a primarily white audience. And I didn't do any ethnic jokes, no Indian jokes for the first couple of years. And then finally, it's a very long story, but there was somebody who told me you should do that. Like that's, you should talk about that because that's no one else can cover it. Like the jokes you're doing, they're fine. They're funny and you're making people laugh. Because in comedy, the first part of it is just getting up there and being comfortable on stage.
Right.
And just getting laughs. So you're telling a lot of jokey jokes, maybe wordplay, that kind of stuff. And then over time, you start to find your own stories because especially now there's so much content, there's so many comics out there that you start to go, what's original? Well, your own story is original. And it's hard for someone to say, well, you ripped that story from. It's like, well, it's my experience. It's hard to say I ripped it from somebody.
Right.
So, you start to talk about that kind of stuff. But I did some accent stuff. I still do a little bit, but it has to be organic. It has to serve the narrative. And the way I always explained it, and this to me was, I think, fairly on point, was when I do my dad's voice, I do an accent. When I do my mom's voice, I don't. And I addressed that early on because I realized the disconnect that would create for people in people's minds. The reality is I don't hear my mom's accent. I hear my dad's accent. I don't hear my mom's. I have to even ask people, does my mom have an Indian accent? And people go, yeah, she has a pretty thick Indian accent. I mean, not as thick as my dad's. And both of them speak extremely good English and write extremely good English. But I don't hear an Indian accent when I hear my mom. And even my brother said to me, really? That's odd because yeah, and a friend of mine's mom said, like, how do her students, she taught fourth grade for 36 years, how do they understand what she's saying? And this is a white woman, and she didn't mean it in any harm. I was at her house, and I go, what do you mean? She goes, well, Rajiv, she has a very thick accent. And I go, like a thick Indian accent? She goes, well, yeah, obviously a thick Indian. No, a thick German accent, right? They were actually descended from Germans. She goes, yeah, it's not even that. Like, my dad has a very thick German accent. I think a lot of kids in fourth grade would have a hard time understanding what he's saying. It's not a racial thing against Indians. It's just a foreign thing. And I thought, wow, I can't hear it. So if I went on stage and did my mom's voice, it's like, okay, then my mom was talking to me. It's like, that's really disingenuous because in your own mind, now you're doing it for an audience.
Right.
That's not even your own experience. Now you're really like dancing like a monkey. That's crazy. But my dad's accent to me is very thick. So if I talk like my dad is going to talk like this, that's not even really his voice, but that's the closest I can approximate. And it's a very, sort of general Indian accent, which is what's so great about Russell Peters. Not only the East Asian accents he can do accents from all over India. They're very different. Calcutta to, Hyderabad to Delhi and all these other places. But that has always been something I don't think I've ever talked about on a podcast or an interview. But my mom's voice versus my dad's voice, I do my mom's voice as American, and it may be may throw the audience off,
Huh.
but that's a way I can stay true to myself.
Do you hear it now that you've had these conversations and like had, a
No.
bit of introspection? No, that's
don't hear it.
fascinating.
I don't hear it. To me, she just sounds like my mom, but she doesn't sound Indian to me.
Is that a factor of you having spent more or less time with one parent versus another, or?
I mean, my parents are together. They're in Fairfield, Ohio. They were together yesterday. Hopefully, they're still together today. They are. No, I mean, I have longer conversations with my mom.
Sure.
But I don't. I mean, I've asked my dad everything under the sun as well at one point or another. So I don't know. I don't know why that is.
So let's stay on this topic of parents. Obviously, you grew up in a community and a family environment where, the limited choices of career options and whatnot. And you studied engineering, then you pivoted into marketing. And then one day you had to tell your parents, I want us to do comedy for a living.
Yeah.
What was that like?
It was tough. It was, a moment. I was talking about this with a friend of mine. We're putting together a show in New York in February, and we were talking. It's called Back to School, and it's kind of a throwback to high school in the 1990s, and a lot of the themes. And she's younger than I, but it was more like, let's split the difference and say we graduated in 98, 99. And so I've been all those talks about the boy bands and Alanis Morissette and Dave Matthews and Nine Inch Nails and all that stuff. So she goes, what were your insecurities as a kid? I go, well, I mean, I'll just open up and tell you. A lot of it was body type stuff. I was very ashamed of just being really skinny and scrawny and hairy, Indian guy. Like BO, like deodorant is something that I had to go ask my dad for when I was in 7th grade. And I was terrified to go ask him for that because it was like, I don't know. I'm not a man. I'm only 13. I'm not Jewish where I get bar mitzvahs or anything like that, right? So it was a really embarrassing time where it took me weeks to be able to even ask him. So I remember, when your parents are always your parents, right? So when I had to tell them that I had left Fiji Water or Fiji Water left me, one way or the other, I would just like, man, I'm walking down Sawtell crying, right? I just go, man, I just kind of went back into my like 13-year-old self, like daddy, mommy, like this is what I did and whatever. And I mean, they were really upset. They were really pissed off. I mean, it was just like a big thing for me to leave Procter and Gamble. That's a job for life.
Especially being from Ohio.
Being from Ohio, being from Cincinnati, that's the dream place to work. I know for a fact that had I stayed there and even downshifted into a role that I easily could have done for the rest of my life in terms of the ability, I would have been making $400,000 or $500,000 a year in perpetuity for a long time with very low expenses. I mean, you're set. You're going to be a multimillionaire for doing work, but the work's not that hard. It's hard. It's not so hard.
Right.
And so when I read about other people's struggles, I'm like, okay, it's not that hard. Okay, so I think comparing it to that, to say now you've left and you've not just gone to like Indianapolis or Columbus, you've gone to Los Angeles. I mean, and now after 12 weeks, you're leaving this job and you're going to be a comedian. And I mean, they even said to me, my dad goes, there was a long silence, and he goes, I hope you're not thinking about becoming a comedian. And what do you say to that? It's almost like a friend. You're taking it with a friend, and she's like, I hope you're not thinking about asking me out. It's like, well, not, it's like at the beginning of Spies Like Us, where Chevy Chase sleeps with his boss, and he goes, I saw my neurologist this morning, and she goes, you're not going to give me some BS that you're dying, are you? And he goes, no, not now. It's like, what do you say to that? Not now.
Right.
And so I said, no, of course. But the irony was, I actually was not thinking about going into comedy. Everybody saw it before I did. This is August of 2006. I spent all of September of 2006 like meditating, writing, thinking about this. And then at the end of that month, I went, okay, October 1st, 2006 is the beginning of my fiscal. I'm going, and I had to really sit with it to think about, is this something I want to do? But man, it was a scary time.
That happened in your 30s, right?
Yeah, I was just 30, yeah.
For a lot of our listeners and I have friends who are listening, right? Like, it's not a very American concept for us to have to even explain, justify, get permission, get approval from our parents when you're 30 freaking years old,
right,
about how you want to live your life. Because
so funny, true.
It's not like we're saying, all right, I need allowance back because I want to go do something fun. It's I think the way that we try to balance our cultural expectations of filial duty and doing right by our parents, it's something that I struggle with daily.
That's funny. That's true. I'm so in it. I didn't even think about that.
But I think it's like for the average, I don't know, non-Asian
average
person.
Joe, because Joe was saying this to me in Antarctica, that it's weird that you talk about being allowed to do something. So
yeah, and it's like,
it's funny.
maybe a lot of people listen to me like, why the hell would you tell your parents you're 30? You can do whatever you want. It's like,
Yeah.
but that's not the world we grew up in.
No, it isn't.
I remember my grandmother telling my dad, like, you're always going to be my kid. And at the time he was 50 something. And I was like, that's right. It's all relative, right? So my parents don't care I'm 30 some years old. I'm always going to be their baby kid.
I was talking to my therapist at the time, and she, she's Hungarian descent. And we were talking about when you go home, you revert into those roles.
Right.
So just like I said, going back to being
Yeah.
13 years old and brothers and whatever. And she goes, if it's any consolation at the time, she goes, I think she was 44, 45 at the time. She goes, my sister's 48. And she goes, we go to cross the street and she still grabs my hand.
Right.
She still grabs my hand. She goes, I'm a 44-year-old woman. I have kids. I don't need you to grab my hand. But she goes, that's her instinct. Just
Sure.
we had an earthquake a couple nights ago. And my instinct, I woke my wife up, but I didn't mean to. When I was in my apartment by myself, I don't think you're supposed to get under the covers, but that's what instinctually you do. But my instinct now is to jump on top of her. Like I put my hands over her head because that's just, I'm just barely waking up or, about to fall asleep. It was really late at night. I had a late night and my instinct was just to go put my hand over her head. Just like parents put their arm out if the kid's in the front seat, right? It's just an instinct.
But you have a seatbelt there, but you still do it.
You're still going to do it. You still want to protect your loved ones. I mean, you do whatever you can and you sacrifice yourself even. You're just like, okay, let me cover if the building's going to fall. It's going to fall on my head, not yours. That's just what you do. It's just, it's an instinct. I think parents have that same idea that in the same way my mom and dad are like, they want us to be okay.
Right.
And they know that, my God, you're going to go do Hollywood. My dad grew up, his brother, and they grew up around Bollywood out in India. So they know how hard it was. They were friends with a lot of filmmakers and Bollywood stars, and they would come into their restaurants. They would meet them and all these kind of things. And they were like, it's really, really hard. And it is really, really hard. I mean, there's no doubt about that.
When did your parents, I wouldn't want to use the word accept because it's very permission driven, and I don't want to talk about your career choice in a permission setting, but did they ever tell you, have they told you yet that they're proud of your career choice? Do they come to your shows and also talk about, was that a thing for you that you wanted them to be okay with your career choice, for you to fully feel that this was your allowed, right?
Sure. That's a great question. And, my experience is very different from my wife's. And I think her experience is much more the immigrant angle from this point of view, meaning that my parents always told us they loved us, that they were proud of us, they encouraged us and all that sort of thing. And my dad, his general posture, I feel like, is fairly negative, but in a crisis situation, he's very positive. And he's who you want behind the wheel in an emergency. He's very good at that. He's a very good go-to guy. Day to day, I'm kind of like, I don't know, my dad's just going to be upset about something or whatever. But in a situation where you think he's really going to blow his top, like when my brother came out of the closet as a gay man, my dad was like, it was like a made-for-TV movie, Jerry. He hugged him, and he just goes, well, you'll always be my son, and I love you. And you're like, dude, what? Like, I thought he was going to freaking burn the house down. And he was like so calm about it, so supportive and all that stuff for my brother's sexuality and all that. So, you really can't ask for a person in a better situation like that. And, whether it's taking care of my mom or all the things that he does. And so, but he and I get into it just day to day. Just we have kind of our, like we're at each other's throats a little bit, but we love each other. That's just the way it is. Whereas my mom is generally a very positive person, but she can see like the downsides of things. She'll be like, okay, be careful with this or watch that. Or I'm like, okay, I read chapter 9. She's like, okay, now read chapter 10.
Right.
Like that's a very Asian kind of like, okay, well, read it again.
Right.
Like there was not. In that case, it was never good enough, right? It was like, okay, well, I got a 95. It's like, why didn't you get 100? So
Sure.
they would encourage us, and she was day to day very, very supportive, very loving, very affectionate family. And so they came to my shows early on and very supportive. They still promote. They sign up people for my newsletter. They bring people to my show. They sit in the front row if I want them to. I usually want them to sit in the middle, not in the front row. They're good about that. So they're very, very supportive of all three of us as sons. Hirsch's experience is much more like, oh, wow, that's interesting. Like my parents were much more very loving but critical. They showed their love through cooking for you and through clothing you. And that was love. They didn't need to say I love you. They didn't need to say I was proud of you and stuff like that. So I think her experience is much more the Asian experience, which is, of course we love you. You don't have to say thank you. You don't have to say I'm sorry. That's all implied. Whereas our family was always a little bit more formal. And I don't know exactly why that is, but
is it a factor of you guys having chosen Ohio as your landing place?
Maybe.
And sort of the more influence of...
Maybe being around more white folks, just being socialized more into, that, and parents would kind of pick and choose sometimes, like if you thank them for dinner, they'd be like, thank me for dinner. I'm your mom, I'm your
Right.
dad. But sometimes like you didn't say anything, like, where's my thank you? It's
Right.
like, well, which one are we doing today? But I think that I think maybe it was that. I think, I'm Punjabi, my wife is Gujarati. I don't know if that really hasn't much to do with it, but and because even her dad grew up and spent a lot of time in England, so that's obviously generally, not all parts of it, but a lot of the places where the Indians go would be kind of more formal and stuff. So I don't know. I think some of it is just, it varies family to family. I mean, it may not be a cultural thing as much as that's just your guys' personalities.
Sure. And to brag about you a little bit, you've been invited to perform in India, big press, just got done wrapping up performing on 7 continents, which nobody else had done before. Your video's gotten 50 million plus views. You've performed on Capitol Hill. At this point, you've made it, right? But the Netflix special is coming. The stadium tours are coming. And maybe that's not even the right way to judge your success as a comic. But so what are your conversations like around this is what I chose to do? And like, I feel very confident that I made the choice. Because I do think that had you gone into comedy straight out of high school, you'd be a different person, right? Because you speak on your experience of having studied the things you did and done the things you've done, worked with the people that you did.
I agree. No, I appreciate the recap. It's always good when someone else tells you your bio, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I really mean it because it's good for you to hear it externally sometimes because you've got this internal track. And I think it was Bill Maher who talked about his parents always saying that our son is trying to be a comedian. And then finally, when he did Letterman or Carson, it was one of them, they would say our son's a comedian. So instead of he's trying to be a comedian, he got that one credit, and then all of a sudden
It validated it.
It validated it. So it's interesting, and the reason I went to Antarctica and became the first person ever to do stand up on 7 continents was, it's a lesson to the kids out there to visualize a goal and achieve it, because you're going to have your own projects and you're going to have industry projects. And I have a little bit of industry success, like a regular at all the clubs here in LA. I mean, I regularly get up at all the clubs in LA. I have booked a few commercials. I've had a couple of small roles in TV and stuff like that. But it's not the industry success I would have expected. I would have thought a Netflix special maybe 3 years ago. I would have done late night a few times and maybe in a couple movies and, all that stuff. So from that standpoint, I kind of go, wow, I kind of haven't made it. But then you look around at your life holistically.
Right.
And not just the grand scheme of, hey, you were born in the United States and you get to live here and live in LA and it's sunny and all those things. And that is for sure. But then also you just look at, you have a house and you're building a studio,
right,
and you've got this lovely wife and you have friends who want to come to Burbank and interview you and, stuff like that. That is something that is a real thing. And so you look at it from that standpoint and go, okay, if I get that Netflix special, if I get that appearance on Fallon or Colbert, will I be happier? You might be. Maybe. I don't know. But you may not be. And, with increased success is also increased stress.
Right.
And so I'm not knocking it and saying, oh, I won't be happier, but you just don't know. And if that, in a lot of what I do when I meditate every day and when I do all this stuff, I just try to get okay with things. And I try to go, okay, if this is cruising altitude and this is it, and you're just going to do this forever, prepare for that. Be ready for that and accept that. Prepare for that Netflix special, the stadium tours, all that. Be ready, be open to it, be moving in that direction. But don't be disappointed because you did make it.
Right.
And you've accomplished more than this is more than I would have dreamed when I started. So you got to look at it that way. You have to go, okay, if Trump is there for 3 or 4 more terms, what do we do?
4 more terms, Jesus.
So you got to go full pessimist here, Jerry. You got to be ready to accept. I'm a bored optimist, but the last 3 years have turned me into a pessimist. So we'll see. Maybe that's good for comedy.
Share with us your performing on Antarctica, because who did you perform to?
Yeah, it's funny. Penguins, right? A black and white audience. So no Asians there. Even
there
the
too.
Maybe pandas would have been a little more Asian, but my wife has been to China and Japan, and I really want to go. I haven't been to either. I haven't been to any of the East Asian countries at all. Well, Thailand, but Thailand is very similar to India in many ways. So it almost feels like it's those are very similar nations in a lot of ways. So Antarctica was great. I'd already done the 5 other continents, and then I went down to Buenos Aires to do a bar gig. I headlined this show that was an international. It's funny doing these international shows, whether you're in Sydney or Buenos Aires or Paris or whatever, because those rooms that are advertised in English are going to pull an international crowd. And so in that room that night were people from literally all over the planet. I mean, Colorado, California, LA, actually, Playa del Rey. It was funny to have someone from Los Angeles in the crowd. Then, of course, you had Argentinians. You had people from Ecuador. The guy from Ecuador was dating a woman from Romania. Then you had somebody from China. You had somebody from Russia. It was just a couple people from Australia, literally all over the place are in this room to watch stand-up comedy in English in Buenos Aires. So I did that, sailed down across the Drake Passage with a bunch of Indian doctors. Actually, after all that, that's the irony is that I eventually go with a bunch of Indian doctors to they had chartered a cruise, and I kind of glommed onto them, my friend Joe and I, and went down to Antarctica, to the peninsula, and did a couple shows, a couple landings on the continent. One for people real quick, because you only have like 30, 40 minutes on the continent before you go back to the boat. So the expedition leader, Flo, she would just like, okay, you got to get people. And she goes, you got to get them. You got to do it quickly because people want to see penguins and seals and whales, and they know they could see you on the boat.
Right.
We got 2 more days to sail back, but you just grab people, and I go, I will. I just need to do 2 minutes. I don't need to do a long set. I'm not trying to do an hour. And then I did some as a joke to some penguins and stuff like that. So
That's funny, man.
It was a good time.
What does it mean for you to be an Asian American or an Indian American? I guess let's talk about identity for a little bit.
Sure, yeah.
Asian American, we're not a monolith.
True.
Does which term resonates with you more, and how do you balance that?
It's interesting. It is, and I think it's a great discussion, because I remember when I was running, and now this sounds so Asian or Indian, whatever you want to call it, at Procter & Gamble, I was helping lead strategy for online digital interactive marketing. And the first meeting I led with all of these interactive marketing managers was, what do we call this? Is it digital? Is it online? Is it interactive? And this is in like 04, 05. So in very nascent web, before really Web 2.0 even took off. And so it's funny, we spent about an hour talking about it, and about 15 minutes in, I go, guys, I know this is kind of weird that we're just talking about semantics here, but I want this discussion to play out, because I think vocabulary drives meaning, and it drives the way people think about things. So I really do want to spend another hour on this, if this is okay with everybody. And, we were all kind of laughing at it, like, does this count as work? We're just sitting here talking about words. And it's like, no, but trust me, that strategy is a lot of like trying to figure out, we got to think strategically. People don't even really know what that means. So for me, in my video, I Am Indian, I say I'm not Asian Indian. I say I'm not East Indian or whatever else. So the forms these days are really weird, because in marketing, they call us Asian Indian, which I don't like at all.
To differentiate between the Native American
Native Americans.
Interesting.
Because you can't even use the word, or you're not supposed to use the word, not can't, and not, let me say it this way. Most Native Americans don't really identify as Indian anymore. Some of them do.
That wasn't their chosen name.
But that wasn't their chosen name. So it's Native American or indigenous, or it varies. It's hard sometimes to really nail these things down, and really would have to ask someone of that descent to get a point of view, another point of view on it.
Right.
But for us, and the joke I say in the video is that there are 1.3 billion of us. We don't need a cardinal direction, right? Don't call us East Indian, because it's also to differentiate versus West Indians who are in the Caribbean.
Right.
But so those folks really are descended from India. And a lot of them mixed with the local cultures, Jamaican, et cetera, on those islands. And so they actually, like Trinidad, Tobago, a lot of their ancestors did really come from India. They are really descended. So they are kind of genetically similar to us. We're East, they're West, but it's weird because there are only, I always say, what are there, like 12 of those people? But there are a couple million maybe,
right.
And then there's a billion. So it still doesn't seem to, I think Indian is great, but then what happens with Indian is it's exclusive because we're really considered South Asian, which is the more inclusive term for Pakistanis,
correct.
Nepalese, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Bangladesh, all these folks sort of lumped in together is a more inclusive term. But what's happening is then we're losing our Indian identity because there are so many of us. We're sort of bending to the will of the minority, which is not necessarily bad, but then you don't use the word Indian anymore. You say South Asian, and then what happened to Indians?
Right.
So I think there's that aspect of it. Then when I'm with Asian folks, when I think of Asian, I think of East Asian. So people who look like you, not me. I tend to say, oh, you came into my house, you took off your shoes. And I said, oh, that's a very Asian thing to do because we are Asian, right? But if you were Indian, I would have just said, oh, what an Indian thing to do.
Right.
I wouldn't have said what an Asian thing to do because I'm being inclusive. And also Asians and Indians do that.
Correct.
So I refer to your folks as East Asian, our folks as South Asian, but we sort of use them interchangeably when we say, oh, we like math, or we like tennis, or we like ping pong. I'll say, oh, that's a very Indian or Asian thing to do. So I don't think of myself as Asian in America, but I am Asian American. A subset of that would be South Asian American, and a subset of that further would be Indian American.
Correct.
When you go to England or across the pond, I think we are looked at as Asian, all of us together.
Yep.
So it just depends on the context, because even calling us minorities, a friend of mine, Uzzard in Chicago, he's a comic, he talks about, stop calling us minorities. We are the majority of the planet.
It's relative to what?
It's very relative.
Correct.
Our ethnic groups of Chinese and Indian, especially, is 40% of the planet. It's like when Louis C.K., rest in peace, said, most people, and he goes, well, most people are dead. If you think about it, most people are dead, whoever lived.
Sure.
Because most people are Chinese. And it was really kind of funny. It's, for the mathematician in me and the engineer in me goes, well, not most people are Chinese.
50.1%, right?
But a plurality. And,
Right.
and the most people are Chinese.
The largest block of people
block of people are Chinese,
Right.
or many people are Chinese. So it's what I say, most people think this, that's a hard thing to prove. That's a measurement. But if I just say many people think this,
Right.
it's very hard to counter argue, because what's many? Is that 10 people? Is that 7 billion?
So I technically speaking, many is one or more, at least by
2 or more, right?
by LSAT definition, or some, I guess. So some is one or more, many is 2 or more. So when you say, some people are interested, it could mean 1.
Really?
So in a past life, I studied for the LSATs because
I've never
a
taken
very
it, so
very
it's
very good
interesting.
Asian, right? Like,
Right.
I ended up not going to law school, but I took the test twice. That's one of the things that they teach you, the relative numbers terms, which I guess is a very fitting discussion for 2 Asian guys.
Very much so.
I'm talking.
So some, even if it's one person, is some?
I think it's just a measurement of the existence of something.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
I'm
But but it tricks people, right? Because many feels like a lot that should be multiple. So it's a relative. Most has to be a finite definition of more than
50%.
half.
Yeah,
Correct.
Which is what PK, you brought up PK. When I interviewed him, I was doing this diversity talk at Bayer Pharmaceuticals up in the Bay Area. I interviewed him and a number of comics about diversity. And he had one of the most insightful points, PK did. He goes, 51, not 99. And he goes, 51% of Asians can't drive, but don't think it's 99. He goes,
Right.
I'm a really good driver.
Right.
So I don't want you to think it applies to me. He goes, my people generally not very good drivers, but I'm a good driver. So he goes, but it is mostly true. He goes, if I'm being honest, I would say that we probably under-index in terms of our driving ability. So it's just kind of funny. It's a horribly racist thing to say, but it's obviously an Asian owning it. It's a different thing. But I think stereotypes do come from somewhere.
Sure.
And it's just kind of an interesting point that's where we run into it. If you think most people of a group do something, it's like rice. Like we all,
Right.
both of our East and South Asians, we love rice. But it's like assuming a person like is coming to your house. Well, he's Indian, so he'll love rice.
Right.
But that's racist. If I said I liked rice, that probably would not be a big surprise to
Right.
people because I'm Indian. So.
Or this is like the Andrew Yang thing, right? Like, are we all good at math?
Yes.
No,
we're not. all good
But
at
we
math.
are. Yes
Right.
and no, right? Like,
Yes and
are
no.
most of us good at math? Probably.
Probably.
But is it
51.
causation or correlation? I
Yeah.
don't know.
That's a good point. 51.
But then to say that we are good at math because we are Asian, that's where you cross the line,
That's
right?
where, you don't really know, because that becomes like, okay, then now you're talking about biology and so instead of sociology.
Sure.
I just saw him on Bill Maher, and man, he is so funny. I love it.
I think, regardless of what happens, I think he's done so much for me.
Great.
People
I'm
that
glad.
look like me.
I'm glad.
My kids,
Sure.
to even watch a debate and to have my kids see a dude that looks like him.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And so I hope he does well.
Mm-hmm.
I hope a lot of his ideas get, instituted regardless of, what happens, here in 10 months. Finish this last thought.
Sure.
Imagine you're writing a letter to the audience. So I'll start and then you finish.
Okay.
Dear Asian Americans.
Hello. Namaste, I guess I should say. Hang in there. It gets better. It's getting better. I think it's getting better. I think if you look at Andrew Yang and some of the folks that we've discussed, we're getting more representation. I think continue telling your stories. Look at Aquafina. Look what she's just accomplished. Look at Parasite and where that is. Look at Slumdog Millionaire and some of the things that are just happening in entertainment, where in almost every ad where there are at least 10 people, you're seeing at least one East Asian, at least one South Asian. In movies, it's a similar type of thing. You're seeing our representation. Keep fighting for what you believe in. At the same time, I think it's important that a friend of mine said, the left is not going to beat the right into submission and vice versa. We all have to coexist. And this is the place to do it. So Asian Americans, we live better than any group of people in the world in history. I think that we have the ability to hold on to our culture. I think that we have the ability to assimilate. And I think that with all the challenges that we face, every community faces challenges. We're at a point in time where it's better to be alive now. It doesn't seem like it sometimes, better than any time in history. We're living in, with all of its faults and flaws, the greatest nation on earth. And we are so privileged to have parents generally that support us, if nothing else, siblings, camaraderie, and look at Jerry and Rajiv sitting here talking and having this conversation in the middle of the day when we probably should be working jobs as a lawyer and as a doctor, and we get to do this in Burbank while the sun is shining and do whatever we want. If that's not inspiration for you, I don't know what is.
Thank you. I think it's very inspirational for a lot of people listening. Share with us where we can find you.
Sure. Besides Burbank, people can find me at Funny Indian. They can find me at Funny Indian on Instagram, Twitter, I think even on YouTube and Facebook. Just put in my name, Rajiv Satyal. And the best place to go probably is funnyindian.com. Redirects to my name, rajivsatyal.com. It has links to all my social media and videos and things like that. Follow me, sign up for my newsletter, drop me a line. It takes me some time to get back to people sometimes, but I will eventually get back to you.
Hey, Rajiv, thank you so much for making time. I've gotten to know you over the last few years, seeing you perform in person, and it is really an honor and a privilege to talk with you. You giving people a voice, both here and back in India, where they look to you and be like, wow, somebody that looks like me, is from my neighborhood, has made it in America. And then that is a point of pride and a point of happiness and really a point of inspiration. So really want to thank you for making the time. I'm very grateful.
Well, that's more than I deserve, but I really appreciate that. It's really been great to host you, and you were very generous. You brought us gifts, which we appreciate. And
never go to somebody's house empty-handed and take off your shoes.
But yeah, only if you're holding your own shoes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jerry.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed listening to my conversation with Rajiv as much as I did having it with him. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, leave a review, and share the episode with 2 or 3 friends who you think might also enjoy it. A huge thanks to Rajiv for making time to join us on the show and sharing his story with us. The song you heard that introduced the show is TLC by Justin Park, and we want to thank Justin and Peter Hong of Studio 5A for letting us share his music with us, and to Jason Liu and to Allison Chang, our editor. Thanks for tuning in to launch week of Dear Asian Americans, where we're sharing with you 5 unique and amazing Asian American stories. Learn more about our guest and the show at DearAsianAmericans.com, on Facebook and Instagram at Dear Asian Americans. And if you or somebody you know would like to come on the show and share your own unique Asian American story, please let me know. Shoot me a DM on Instagram or email me at hello@DearAsianAmericans.com. Thank you so much for tuning in. Signing off on episode 3 of Dear Asian Americans, I am your host, Jerry Wan.